The galaxy was old and full of wonders that humans could barely imagine. And among all the great civilizations that ruled the stars, none were more proud than the Volanthi Empire. The Volanthi were tall and beautiful creatures with skin that shimmered like precious gems in the light, and they could speak directly into the minds of others with their powerful telepathic abilities. They had ruled their corner of the galaxy for 10,000 years, and they looked down upon younger species the way a king might look down upon the insects beneath his feet. Humans were one of those younger species, and the Volanthi considered them to be little more than clever animals. They were fragile creatures who lived barely a century before dying of old age, and they could not touch minds or sense the thoughts of others. The Volanthi tolerated humans in their space, but they never respected them, and they certainly never expected anything great from such primitive beings. Princess Salar of Velkoth stood at the viewing window of her royal transport ship and watched the stars drift slowly past. She was the only daughter of Emperor Thalvern Velkoth, and she was traveling to a diplomatic meeting on a distant world. Her escort consisted of 3 warships filled with the finest Volanthi warriors, and she felt perfectly safe in their protection. She was wrong to feel safe. The attack came without warning when a fleet of Karax raiders dropped out of hyperspace directly in front of the convoy. The Karax were brutal slavers who cared nothing for laws or treaties, and they saw the royal transport as the greatest prize they had ever encountered. A Volanthi princess would fetch a fortune on the black markets of the Outer Rim. The battle was short and terrible. The Volanthi warriors fought with elegant precision and graceful combat forms, but the Karax outnumbered them 10 to 1. One by one, the escort ships were destroyed or disabled, and soon the raiders were cutting through the hull of the royal transport itself. Salara retreated to the inner chambers with her remaining guards, but she knew it was only a matter of time. She could feel the fear and pain of her protectors dying all around her through her telepathic senses, and she prepared herself for capture or death. Far across the void of space, a human named Marcus Cole was hauling cargo in his old freighter ship called the Wandering Star. Marcus was 34 years old with dark hair that was always messy and scars on his hands from years of hard work. He had served in the human military once, but those days were behind him now, and he made his living moving goods from one station to another. His ship was old and beaten up, and most of the weapon systems had been decommissioned years ago. He was nobody special in a galaxy full of ancient empires and powerful beings. Just another human trying to survive in a universe that did not care about him. Then his communication system picked up the distress signal. Marcus listened to the frantic Volanthi transmission and learned that a royal convoy was under attack by Karax raiders. He checked his navigation computer and found that he was only 20 minutes away at maximum speed. He also knew that no help would arrive in time from the Volanthi fleet. Any sensible person would have ignored the signal and continued on their way. The Volanthi had never done anything for humans, and fighting Karax raiders was suicide for a single cargo hauler. Marcus had no obligation to help, and no one would blame him for staying out of a fight that was not his concern. Marcus changed course and pushed his engines to full power. He did not think about the odds or calculate his chances of survival. He did not consider whether the Volanthi deserved his help or whether they would even thank him for it. Someone was in trouble, and that was all that mattered to the human pilot racing toward danger. The Wandering Star dropped out of hyperspace in the middle of chaos. Debris from destroyed ships floated everywhere, and the raider vessels were already attached to the royal transport, like parasites feeding on a dying animal. Marcus counted at least 50 raiders on his sensors, and he knew his ship could not fight them in direct combat. So he did something no Volanthi would ever consider. He aimed his freighter directly at the smallest raider ship and accelerated. At the last moment, he activated his emergency thrusters and spun away, but not before scraping against the raider hull and sending both ships tumbling. The chaos gave him the opening he needed, and he slammed his ship against the Royal Transport airlock. Marcus grabbed a plasma pistol and a metal pipe from his cargo hold. He did not have fancy weapons or elegant armor, just whatever he could find on his battered old ship. He sealed his suit and opened the airlock. The first Karax raider he met was a massive creature with 4 arms and teeth like knives. It swung a blade at Marcus with deadly speed, and the human barely dodged in time. He smashed the metal pipe into the creature's knee and heard something crack, then shot it twice in the chest before it could recover. More raiders came rushing down the corridor, and Marcus fought them with brutal efficiency. Where Volanthi warriors danced gracefully around their opponents, Marcus crashed into them like a wild animal. He used every dirty trick he knew from his military days, and he refused to stop no matter how many wounds he took. A blade cut across his arm, but he kept fighting. A plasma burn scorched his shoulder, but he kept fighting. He took 17 wounds in total, and each one would have stopped a Volanthi warrior cold. But Marcus Cole did not stop. The raiders had never seen anything like this crazy human who would not stay down. They were used to species that surrendered when the pain became too great. But Marcus seemed to become more dangerous the more they hurt him. Fear began to spread among the Korax, and some of them started to retreat. Marcus found Princess Saylara in the inner chambers, surrounded by the bodies of her fallen guards. She stared at the bloody human with wide eyes, unable to believe what she was seeing. Her telepathic senses could not read his mind, but she could see the determination burning in his eyes. "Come with me if you want to live," Marcus said, and he held out his blood-covered hand. Saylara had never taken the hand of a human before, but she reached out and let him pull her to her feet. Together, they ran through the corridors of the dying ship, and Marcus shot down any raider that got in their way. They reached the Wandering Star just as the raider reinforcements arrived. Marcus threw Saylara into the cargo hold and sealed the airlock behind them. He stumbled to the cockpit and activated the hyperspace drive, and the old freighter screamed into the void just seconds before the raiders could stop them. Saylara watched the human collapse into his pilot's seat, bleeding from wounds that should have killed him. His breathing was rough and his hands were shaking, but he was alive, and so was she. "Why?" she asked in a voice that trembled with confusion. "Why did you come for me when no one else would?" Marcus looked at her with tired eyes and gave a small shrug. "Someone was in trouble," he said simply, as if that explained everything. The princess stared at him for a long moment, and she realized that she did not understand humans at all. She had always thought they were simple and primitive creatures, but this one had just done something that none of her own people would have dared. As the Wandering Star carried them toward Volanthi space, Saylara began to wonder if perhaps her people had been wrong about humans all along. She had no idea how much her life was about to change. The Volanthi throne world of Sarath Prime was the most beautiful planet Marcus had ever seen. Great towers of crystal and gold rose toward the purple sky, and gardens filled with strange flowers stretched as far as the eye could see. Everything was elegant and perfect, and Marcus felt like a dirty stain on a pristine white cloth. His wounds had been treated by Volanthi healers, who seemed amazed that he was still alive. They whispered to each other in their musical language and kept touching his scars with expressions of disbelief. Marcus just wanted to refuel his ship and get back to his normal life of hauling cargo. Princess Saylara had been taken away by her attendants the moment they landed, and Marcus had not seen her since. He figured she was probably happy to be rid of the crude human who had dragged her through blood and fire. That was fine with him, because he was not comfortable around royalty anyway. A Volanthi official came to Marcus and informed him that Emperor Thalvern Velkoth wished to see him in the throne room. Marcus thought this was probably just a formal thank you before they sent him on his way, so he agreed to follow the official through the gleaming halls of the imperial palace. The throne room was massive and filled with hundreds of Volanti nobles dressed in flowing robes of silver and gold. They all turned to stare at Marcus as he walked toward the throne, and he could feel their contempt pressing against him even though he could not read their minds. He was the only human in the room, and he had never felt more out of place in his entire life. Emperor Thalvarin sat upon a throne carved from a single enormous crystal, and his eyes were cold and ancient. He was even taller than other Volanti, and his presence filled the room with power that made Marcus want to kneel. Princess Selara stood beside her father, dressed in royal garments that made her look like a stranger compared to the frightened woman Marcus had rescued. "Human," the Emperor said in a voice that echoed through the chamber, "you have done something remarkable, and the Volanti do not forget such deeds." Marcus nodded and waited for the Emperor to thank him and send him home. He was already thinking about which station he would visit first to pick up his next cargo job. "You have saved the life of my daughter, the heir to my throne," the Emperor continued, "and by doing so, you have invoked the ancient law of Kelvoreth." The nobles in the room gasped and whispered to each other, and Marcus noticed that Selara had gone very pale. He did not know what Kelvoreth meant, but he was starting to think it was not good news. The Kelvoreth states that any person who saves the life of Volanti royalty is bound to them by sacred debt, the Emperor explained, and this debt can only be resolved in one way. Marcus waited for the Emperor to tell him he would receive money or a medal or maybe a nice letter of appreciation. Instead, the ancient ruler spoke words that made the human's blood run cold. "You must marry my daughter." The room erupted in chaos as nobles shouted in outrage and disbelief. Selara looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor, and Marcus just stood there with his mouth hanging open like a fool. Surely this was some kind of joke or test that the Volanti used to confuse outsiders. Marcus laughed out loud because the situation was so ridiculous. But when he looked around the throne room, he saw that no one else was laughing. The nobles looked furious, Selara looked horrified, and the Emperor looked completely serious. "Wait," Marcus said slowly. "You cannot actually mean that, right? I just wanted to help someone in trouble, not marry into an alien royal family." The Emperor's eyes narrowed dangerously at the human's casual tone. No one spoke to the ruler of the Volanti Empire with such disrespect, but Marcus did not know any better. He was just a cargo hauler who had never learned the proper ways to address ancient alien monarchs. "The Kelvoreth is not a suggestion," the Emperor said coldly. "It is the most sacred law of our people. It has existed for 10,000 years, and it has never been broken. You saved my daughter's life, and now you must marry her." Selara stepped forward with desperation in her eyes. She was proud and elegant like all her kind, but the thought of marrying a human clearly filled her with horror. "Father," she said in a trembling voice, "there must be another way. He is a human, a creature who cannot even touch minds. How can I be bound to someone whose thoughts I cannot feel? How can I marry someone who will die of old age before I have even grown past my youth?" The Emperor raised his hand to silence her. His face showed no emotion, but Marcus thought he could see something like sympathy hiding deep in those ancient eyes. "The law is the law," the Emperor said firmly, "and not even I can change it. If the human refuses, then he declares that your life has no value. Such an insult can only be answered with war, and the Volanti fleet will be forced to destroy every human colony in the galaxy." Marcus felt his stomach drop as the weight of those words hit him. He had saved one life and somehow put millions of lives in danger. The Volanti were not joking about this ancient law, and refusing the marriage would lead to the deaths of countless innocent humans. "This is insane," Marcus said desperately. "I did not ask for any of this. I just answered a distress call because someone needed help." The Emperor leaned forward on his throne and studied the human with those cold, calculating eyes. For a moment, Marcus thought he saw something strange in the ruler's expression, almost like he was waiting for something specific to happen. "You have 1 day to make your decision," the emperor announced, "and you will be given quarters in the palace until then. Guards, escort the human to his chambers." Strong hands grabbed Marcus and pulled him away from the throne. He looked back at Salara and saw her watching him with an expression he could not understand. Was it anger or fear or something else entirely? He wished he could read minds like the Volanthi so he would know what she was thinking. The quarters they gave him were more luxurious than anything Marcus had ever seen. The bed was soft as clouds, and the windows looked out over gardens that seemed to glow in the evening light. But Marcus could not enjoy any of it because his mind was racing with impossible thoughts. He paced back and forth across the beautiful room and tried to figure out what to do. If he refused the marriage, the Volanthi would attack human colonies and millions of people would die. If he accepted the marriage, he would be trapped on an alien world, married to a woman who clearly despised him. Neither option seemed good, but Marcus knew he could not let innocent people suffer because of his choices. He had always tried to help others when he could, and running away now would go against everything he believed in. As the night grew dark outside his window, Marcus made his decision. He would stay and accept this strange alien law because that was the only way to protect his people. He did not know what kind of life waited for him as the husband of a Volanthi princess, but he would face it the same way he faced everything else. One step at a time, with stubborn human determination. He had no idea that his troubles were only just beginning, and that forces were already moving in the shadows to make sure this marriage would never happen. Someone in the imperial court had dark plans for the princess, and they were not about to let a simple human stand in their way. But Marcus Cole had surprised the galaxy once before, and he would do it again. The days that followed were the strangest of Marcus Cole's entire life. He was trapped in a palace full of aliens who looked at him like he was something disgusting they had found on the bottom of their elegant shoes. The servants whispered about him, the nobles sneered at him, and Princess Salara avoided him whenever she could. Marcus tried to make the best of his situation, because giving up was not in his nature. He explored the palace gardens and learned the names of the strange flowers that grew there. He talked with the guards who watched him, even though they rarely answered. He ate the strange Volanthi food and only threw up twice when he tried something that did not agree with human stomachs. The first assassination attempt came on his 5th night in the palace. Marcus woke up to find a shadow moving through his darkened room. His military training kicked in before he was fully awake, and he rolled off the bed just as a blade cut through the place where his head had been. The assassin was fast and graceful like all Volanthi, but Marcus fought back with wild desperation that seemed to confuse the attacker. Volanthi assassins were trained to read minds and predict their target's movements. They could see what you were going to do before you did it, and that made them nearly impossible to fight. But Marcus's mind was a closed book to their telepathic abilities, and his chaotic fighting style followed no logical pattern they could predict. Marcus grabbed a decorative vase and smashed it over the assassin's head. The attacker stumbled, and Marcus tackled them to the ground with all his weight. They struggled together on the floor until palace guards burst in and pulled the assassin away. The next morning, Salara came to visit Marcus in his chambers. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and studied him with those shimmering eyes that seemed to glow in the light. "You survived," she said in a voice that sounded almost impressed. "The Volanthi assassin guilds have a perfect record of success, and yet a human defeated one of their members." Marcus shrugged and touched the bandage on his arm where the assassin's blade had cut him. The wound hurt, but he had experienced worse during his rescue of the princess. "I got lucky," he said simply, "and your assassins seem confused when they cannot read my thoughts." Salara tilted her head and studied him with curious interest. She had never met anyone whose mind she could not touch, and Marcus was like a mystery she could not solve. Her telepathic senses could feel his emotions in a vague way, but his actual thoughts were completely hidden from her. "How do humans communicate without telepathy?" she asked suddenly. "How do you understand each other when you cannot share thoughts directly?" Marcus thought about the question for a moment before answering. It was strange to realize that something so normal to him seemed impossible to the Volanthi. "We talk," he explained, "and we watch each other's faces and bodies for signs of what the other person is feeling. Sometimes we get it wrong, but that is part of being human. We learn to trust people, even when we cannot see inside their heads." Selara frowned at this explanation because it made no sense to her. How could anyone trust someone they could not read? How could any relationship survive without the ability to share thoughts and feelings directly? The human way of life seemed lonely and dangerous compared to the Volanthi connection. Over the next few weeks, more assassination attempts came. A poisoned meal that Marcus refused to eat because it smelled wrong. A rigged transport that he avoided because the pilot seemed nervous. A sniper who missed because Marcus randomly decided to stop and look at a flower at exactly the right moment. The assassins grew more frustrated with each failure, and the nobles grew more angry. They could not understand how this simple human kept surviving their best efforts. Marcus was not smarter or stronger than them, but he was completely unpredictable, and that made him almost impossible to kill. Selara found herself watching Marcus more and more as the days passed. She told herself it was because she wanted to understand how he survived, but the truth was more complicated. She had never met anyone like this strange human who laughed at danger and made friends with servants. She watched him share his food with a palace gardener who looked hungry. She saw him comfort a young guard who had received bad news from home. She noticed how he treated everyone with the same casual warmth, whether they were nobles or workers. One evening she followed Marcus to a quiet corner of the garden where he sat alone. He was looking up at the stars with a sad expression on his face, and for the first time, Selara felt something like sympathy for the human. "What are you thinking about?" she asked as she sat down beside him. Marcus was quiet for a long moment before he answered. When he spoke, his voice was soft and tired. "I am thinking about Earth," he said, "and all the people back home who I will probably never see again. My sister has children who I have not met, and my parents are getting old. I gave all that up when I answered your distress call, but I did not know that at the time." Selara felt a strange pain in her chest at his words. She had never considered what Marcus had lost by saving her, and now she realized that his sacrifice was even greater than she had understood. "Why did you do it?" she asked the question that had bothered her since the rescue. "Why did you risk everything for a stranger from a species that looks down on your kind?" Marcus turned to look at her, and his eyes were full of something she could not identify. It was not anger or resentment, but something softer and sadder. "Because you were in trouble," he said with that same simple honesty, "and I could not just fly away and let you die. It would not have been right, no matter who you were or how your people treat mine." Selara stared at him in complete confusion. The Volanthi made decisions based on logic and calculation, weighing benefits against costs before taking any action. The idea of helping someone simply because it was right seemed irrational and foolish. But watching Marcus now, seeing the genuine kindness in his eyes, Selara began to understand something important. Humans did not act based on logic alone, because they were driven by something the Volanthi had forgotten how to feel. They were driven by compassion, by empathy, by the simple desire to help others regardless of the cost. It was inefficient and irrational and completely beautiful. "You are very strange," Selara said quietly, "and I do not understand you at all, but I think I'm beginning to see why my father's law chose you." Marcus smiled at her words, and Selara felt her heart do something strange in her chest. She had never noticed before how warm his smile was, or how his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was happy. "Maybe we can figure this out together," Marcus suggested, "one step at a time." For the first time since the rescue, Salara did not feel horrified by the idea of marrying this human. She felt curious and confused and maybe just a little bit hopeful. She had no idea that danger was closing in around them both, and that soon they would need to trust each other with their lives. Marcus discovered the conspiracy by accident when he got lost in the palace corridors one night. He had been wandering around because he could not sleep, and he ended up in a part of the building he had never seen before. That was when he heard voices coming from behind a heavy door, and something told him to stop and listen. Two Volanthi were talking in hushed tones, and one of them mentioned the name of High Lord Vathan. Marcus had heard that name before because Vathan was the Emperor's cousin and one of the most powerful nobles in the Empire. The voices spoke of plans and payments and a second attempt to capture the princess. Marcus pressed his ear against the door and heard something that made his blood freeze. The original attack on Salara's convoy had not been random at all. High Lord Vathan had paid the Korax raiders to kidnap the princess, and he was planning to try again. His goal was to trigger a war that would force the Emperor from power and put Vathan on the throne. The human moved silently away from the door and hurried back to his quarters. His heart was pounding with fear and anger as he thought about what he had learned. Salara was in danger, and the threat was coming from inside the palace itself. Marcus found Salara the next morning and pulled her aside to a private corner of the garden. She looked surprised by his urgent manner, but she did not resist when he led her away from the other nobles. "I need to tell you something important," Marcus whispered, "and you have to promise to believe me even though it sounds crazy." Salara studied his face with her shimmering eyes, and even though she could not read his mind, she could see the genuine worry in his expression. She nodded slowly and waited for him to continue. Marcus told her everything he had overheard the night before. He explained how Vathan had arranged the original attack and how he was planning another attempt on her life. Salara listened with growing horror as she realized that her own family member wanted her dead. "Vathan has always been ambitious," she said when Marcus finished, "but I never thought he would go this far. If what you say is true, then no one in the palace is safe." Marcus nodded grimly and looked around to make sure no one was watching them. The beautiful garden suddenly felt dangerous, like every shadow might hide an enemy. "We need proof," Marcus said. "Something solid that we can show your father. If we accuse Vathan without evidence, he will just deny everything and probably have us both killed." Salara thought about this and realized Marcus was right. Volanthi politics required proof before any accusation could be made, and Vathan was too clever to leave obvious evidence lying around. They would need to find the truth themselves. Over the next few days, Marcus and Salara worked together to investigate the conspiracy. They searched through records and followed suspicious servants and gathered bits of information piece by piece. It was dangerous work because Vathan had spies everywhere, and one wrong move could get them both killed. Marcus found himself enjoying the work despite the danger, and he realized that he and Salara made a good team. She was smart and resourceful in ways he had not expected, and she knew the palace and its secrets better than anyone. Meanwhile, Marcus brought a fresh perspective that helped them see things the Volanthi might miss. They discovered that Vathan had a secret stronghold on a moon in the outer reaches of Volanthi space. The stronghold was where he met with his Korax allies and planned his schemes against the throne. If they could get inside and find proof of his treason, they could bring him down. "This is too dangerous," Salara said when Marcus proposed infiltrating the stronghold. "Vathan has an army of guards and assassins protecting that place. We would never make it inside alive." Marcus grinned at her with that stubborn human confidence that drove her crazy. He had already made up his mind, and she could see that nothing would change it. "I made it through a ship full of Karax raiders to save you," he reminded her. "And this cannot be much worse than that. Besides, you will be there to help me this time." Selara stared at him in shock because she had assumed Marcus would go alone. The idea of joining him on such a dangerous mission was terrifying, but she also felt a strange excitement building in her chest. "You want me to come with you?" she asked in disbelief. "Of course," Marcus said simply. "We are partners now, right? Partners stick together." Selara did not know what to say to that. No one had ever called her a partner before, and the word made her feel warm inside. She had been trained her whole life to be a princess, to stand above others and let them serve her. But Marcus treated her like an equal, and she realized that she liked it. They stole a small ship and flew to Vathan's moon under cover of darkness. The journey took several hours, and they spent the time planning their approach and checking their weapons. Marcus showed Selara some human fighting techniques, and she showed him how to avoid Volanthi security systems. The stronghold was a massive fortress built into the side of a mountain. Guards patrolled every entrance, and security systems watched every corridor. Getting inside would require all their skill and more than a little luck. Marcus and Selara worked together like they had been doing it for years. She used her telepathy to sense when guards were nearby, and he used his unpredictability to confuse any who spotted them. They moved through the shadows like ghosts, getting closer and closer to Vathan's private chambers. They found the evidence they needed in a hidden safe behind Vathan's desk. Documents and recordings that proved his connection to the Korax and his plans to overthrow the Emperor. Selara's hands trembled as she held the proof of her relative's betrayal. But their luck ran out when alarms started screaming throughout the stronghold. Guards came running from every direction, and Vathan himself appeared at the end of the corridor with murder in his eyes. "You foolish children," Vathan snarled. "Did you really think you could sneak into my stronghold and steal my secrets? Now you will both die, and no one will ever know the truth." Marcus stepped in front of Selara and raised his weapon. His body was tense and ready for battle, and his eyes were cold with determination. "Run," he told Selara without looking back. "Get the evidence to your father." "I am not leaving you," she shouted back. The battle that followed was brutal and desperate. Marcus fought with everything he had, taking down guard after guard with his wild human style. Selara fought beside him, using her elegance and telepathy to strike where enemies were weakest. Together, they carved a path through Vathan's forces toward the exit. But there were too many enemies, and soon they were surrounded. Vathan laughed as his guards closed in on the exhausted pair. "It is over," he declared, "and now you will both watch each other die." Vathan raised his weapon and fired at Selara. Marcus saw the blast coming and threw himself in front of her without thinking. The plasma bolt hit him square in the chest, and he collapsed to the ground with smoke rising from his wound. "No!" Selara screamed as she dropped to his side. Marcus looked up at her with pain-filled eyes, but he was still breathing. The wound was terrible, but he was still alive, still fighting. "Get out of here," he whispered. "Please." Selara felt something break open inside her chest as she looked at this strange, brave human who had just taken a blast meant for her. He had saved her twice now, and she realized that she could not imagine her life without him. She grabbed the evidence and Marcus's arm, and she dragged him toward the exit with strength she did not know she had. Vathan screamed for his guards to stop them, but Selara moved with desperate speed. They reached their ship and escaped into space just as Vathan's forces opened fire. The small vessel shook with impacts, but it held together long enough to jump into hyperspace. Selara looked down at Marcus, lying unconscious on the floor, bleeding from wounds that should have killed any Volanthi twice over. But his heart was still beating, and his chest was still rising and falling. Humans were strange and confusing and completely wonderful, she thought. And she was never going to let this one go. 6 weeks passed before Marcus opened his eyes again, and when he did, he found himself in the most beautiful room he had ever seen. Soft light filtered through crystal windows, and the scent of strange flowers filled the air. For a moment, he thought he had died and gone to some kind of alien heaven. Then the pain hit him, and he knew he was still very much alive. His chest felt like someone had driven a hot knife through it, and every breath sent fire racing through his body. He tried to sit up, but could not find the strength, so he lay there and stared at the ceiling instead. A door opened somewhere nearby, and Marcus heard footsteps approaching his bed. He turned his head and saw Princess Salara standing beside him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Her eyes were red like she had been crying, and her usually perfect hair was messy and tangled. "You are awake," she said in a voice that trembled with relief. "The healers said you might never wake up, but I knew you would. Humans are too stubborn to die." Marcus tried to laugh, but it came out as a painful cough instead. He reached up and touched his chest where the plasma bolt had hit him, feeling the thick bandages that covered the wound. "What happened?" he asked weakly. "Did we stop Vathan?" Salara nodded and sat down on the edge of his bed. She took his hand in hers, and Marcus noticed that she did not seem disgusted by touching him anymore. "Vathan has been arrested and stripped of all his titles," she explained. "The evidence we found proved everything, and the Emperor sentenced him to exile in the outer darkness. His conspiracy is finished, and the Corax raiders have fled back to their own territory." Marcus felt relief wash over him at the news. All that pain and danger had been worth it if Salar was safe and the threat was ended. He closed his eyes and let himself relax for the first time in weeks. "I thought you were going to die," Salara said quietly, "and I realized that I did not want you to die. I realized that I wanted you to stay with me, not because of the law, but because of something else." Marcus opened his eyes and looked at her with surprise. The proud princess, who had been horrified at the thought of marrying a human, was now holding his hand and confessing her feelings. Something had changed between them during their adventure, something that neither of them had expected. "I thought you hated me," Marcus said honestly. "I thought you saw me as a primitive creature who was ruining your life." Salara shook her head and squeezed his hand tighter. Her eyes were shining with emotions that seemed strange on her elegant face. "I was wrong about you," she admitted. "I was wrong about all humans. You showed me that there is more to life than logic and calculation. You showed me what it means to be brave and kind without expecting anything in return." Marcus did not know what to say, so he just looked at her and smiled. It hurt to smile because everything hurt, but he could not stop himself. A few days later, Emperor Thalvern came to visit Marcus in his recovery room. The ancient ruler dismissed the healers and guards and sat down in a chair beside the human's bed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You saved my daughter twice," the Emperor finally said, "and you exposed a traitor who would have destroyed my empire. I owe you more than I can ever repay." Marcus shrugged carefully to avoid hurting his chest. He had not done any of it for rewards or recognition, and the Emperor's gratitude felt strange and uncomfortable. "I did what needed to be done," Marcus replied. "Anyone would have done the same." The Emperor shook his head slowly, and something like a smile appeared on his ancient face. It was the first time Marcus had seen the ruler show any emotion at all. "That is where you are wrong," the Emperor said. "Not anyone would have done what you did. The Volanthi value logic and self-preservation above all else, and we would never risk our lives for strangers. You have shown us something we had forgotten, something that makes your species remarkable." Marcus did not know how to respond to such praise from the most powerful being in this part of the galaxy. He just lay there and tried not to feel embarrassed. "I must confess something to you," the Emperor continued. "When I invoked the Kelvoreth, I expected you to flee. I thought you would run away rather than face marriage to my daughter. and that would have given me legal grounds to dismiss you without offense. I never imagined you would actually stay." Marcus thought about this and realized that the Emperor had tried to give him an easy way out. But running away had never been an option for someone like Marcus Cole. "I could not leave," Marcus said simply. "Not when staying meant protecting my people from war. Besides, your daughter grew on me." The Emperor laughed at that, a deep and genuine sound that echoed through the room. It was probably the first time he had laughed in centuries. "I came here to offer you freedom," the Emperor said. "A quiet annulment of the Kelvoroth, riches beyond measure, and safe passage back to your human worlds. You have more than earned the right to return to your old life." Marcus felt his heart skip at the offer. He could go home and see his family and return to hauling cargo across the stars. He could leave behind all the politics and danger of the Volanthi court. But even as he considered the offer, he knew he could not accept it. "I need to talk to Salar first," he said, "before I make any decisions." The Emperor nodded like he had expected this answer. He rose from his chair and walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at the human lying in the bed. "My daughter has been sitting outside your room every day since you arrived," the Emperor said. "She has barely eaten or slept because she was so worried about you. I think you already know what she will say." After the Emperor left, Solara came into the room with nervous energy radiating from every part of her body. She stood at the foot of the bed and looked at Marcus with eyes full of hope and fear. "My father told me he offered you freedom," she said carefully, "and I want you to know that I will not hold you to the Kelvoroth if you wish to leave. You have given so much already, and I have no right to ask for more." Marcus pushed himself up into a sitting position despite the pain. He needed to look at her properly for what he was about to say. "I am terrified of everything about this situation," he admitted. "I do not understand your culture or your people or half of what goes on in this palace. I will probably make mistakes and embarrass you in front of important nobles." Solara's face fell as she heard his words, and Marcus could see her preparing for rejection. But he was not finished. "But I have never run from fear before," he continued, "and I am not going to start now. I want to stay with you, Solara. Not because of some ancient law, but because I choose to." Solara's eyes went wide with shock and joy, and she rushed forward to embrace him. Marcus gasped in pain as she hugged him too tightly, but he did not push her away. "I choose you too," she whispered against his shoulder. "I choose you, Marcus Cole." The wedding was held 1 month later in the great hall of the Imperial Palace. Thousands of Volanthi watched in amazement as their princess married a human, something that had never happened in all their long history. Many still disapproved, but many others had begun to see humans in a new light. Marcus stood at the altar in borrowed robes that did not quite fit his human body. He felt ridiculous and out of place, but Solara was smiling at him, and that made everything else fade away. When it came time for his wedding speech, Marcus looked out at the sea of shimmering Volanthi faces and took a deep breath. "I do not know what the future holds," he said honestly. "Humans never do. We cannot read minds or predict what comes next. We just face each day as it comes and do our best to help each other along the way. That is all I can promise to do for your princess, but I promise to do it with everything I have." The hall was silent for a long moment, and Marcus worried that he had said something wrong. But then Solara took his hand and smiled up at him with tears in her eyes. "That is more than enough," she said. "That is everything." Across the galaxy, news of the wedding spread like wildfire. A human had married into the Volanthi royal family, and he had earned that place through courage and kindness. Other species began to look at humanity differently, wondering what else these strange, short-lived creatures might be capable of. On human worlds, people lifted their heads a little higher. They had always been looked down upon by older species, but now one of their own stood beside a princess. Marcus Cole had shown the galaxy that humans were not lesser beings, just different ones with their own unique strengths. As Marcus and Saylara walked out of the great hall as husband and wife, they did not know what challenges awaited them. They did not know about the enemies who were already plotting against them or the adventures that lay ahead. But they knew they would face it all together, one step at a time. And somewhere in the depths of space, the remnants of the Corax raiders watched and waited. They had not forgotten the human who had humiliated them, and they swore that one day they would have their revenge. But that is a story for another time.